This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 22nd chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap Jesus in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere, and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. The Gospel of the Lord. You know, sometimes we realize that so much has changed in the 2,000 years since the New Testament was written that it can be amazing to find out that there are some things that have not changed at all. And one of them is this. If you want to start a really big fight and make everybody all nervous and upset, begin a conversation about taxes and tax policy. Almost always that will upset people, and that was the goal in today's gospel reading. Two groups of people come together who normally despise each other. They would not be caught dead in the same room together, and yet they're so upset with Jesus that they decide temporarily to put their feud on hold. The Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees are these people who are kind of professional biblical scholars, and they are very, very concerned about how people are going to behave purely and in accordance with their religion and all the religious precepts and all this kind of stuff. And they hate the fact that other groups are actually compromising their religion by collaborating with the Romans, which of course are the Herodians. They are, as their name implies, the people that are hanging out with King Herod. They are part of the puppet government that collaborates with the Romans. So these two groups never, ever want to be seen in the same place together. But now they come together because they're bothered by what Jesus is doing. And they butter him up with this line, "Teacher, we know that you teach the way of truth. You don't show partiality to anybody. So tell us what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" It's a more loaded question than it seems at first. If you were to ask any of us, is it lawful to pay your taxes? You would probably answer, well, of course it's lawful to pay my taxes. In fact, if I were not required by law to pay my taxes, I would not pay them, right? But the question here isn't about the Roman law. It's rather about the law of Moses, the religious law. Could you, in fact, be a good Jew and pay taxes, not to your own country, but to the Roman emperor? It was a question that got everybody immediately upset. So Jesus does what he was not expected to do, and he said, "Show me the coin. Show me the coin used to pay the tax." So they bring him out this denarius, the little coin that I showed the kids. It's a real tiny little thing, but it's basically one of the most common coins of the Roman Empire. And it doesn't look like it should be a big deal. But this little coin had powerful effects. It had a powerful effect because every single time any Jewish person had to pick up or see this coin, they saw the face of the emperor. They probably never had met a Roman emperor. But every time they saw this coin, it reminded them of the presence of the emperor and of Rome in their lives. We often think, probably because we've read or we've ended up watching too many Jesus of Nazareth movies and things like that, that people experience Romans and Roman soldiers every day in their lives. You know, they're walking down the street, just time to do their shopping, and here comes a bunch of Romans marching down the street. But by and large, Roman soldiers were garrisoned over by the Mediterranean and kind of out on the coast where it was safe. or they were holed up in the forts. The average Jewish person did not see a Roman soldier every day. But every day they saw this coin. And every time they saw it, they were reminded of the presence of Rome, even if they were trying to ignore that presence. And they didn't just get reminded of the presence of the Romans. This little coin had the power to make them absolutely crazy. It really angered them, because it's one thing to have to pay taxes to your government and you think, well, maybe I'm paying too much, maybe my taxes are being spent wrong, whatever, those kinds of things. And it would be another thing to have to pay taxes right to a foreign government, to some government not your own. But our politicians, as egomaniacal as many of them are, not a single one of them stands up and says, I am God. But that's what Caesar did. All of the Roman emperors declared themselves to be gods. They were worshipped. Incense was burned to them. So the question was, if I take this coin and I pay the tax to the emperor, am I just paying a tax to a foreign government? Or am I in fact paying tribute to a foreign god? Am I worshiping a foreign god by being willing to pay this tax? That's the question about, is it lawful according to the law of Moses to pay this tax? And whether or not the answer was yes or no to that, even so, it made people really, really angry. It did something to them viscerally to have to actually buy into the system. Because even if they said, I'm not really worshiping a foreign god, they were trapped in that system. And you know how something happens in your day and it just makes you go, argh! That happened every time they had to see or touch this coin. And maybe the most difficult thing was the fact that they had to use this coin. There were some times that they could use Jewish coins for various things, but for a lot of their economy, this was the only mode of currency that was going to be allowed. They had to actually use this coin in their daily lives, and in so doing, they were reminded that the real power of Rome was not so much that the Roman soldiers could march through the streets and kick them and beat them up and stab them with the spears and all that kind of stuff. The real power was the economic power they had over them. If I control your money, if I control your currency, I control you. That's what the Romans had them literally by the purse strings. That was, of course, why the Romans were there in the first place. You know, sometimes we don't realize that the reason that all of these people in the Bible fight over what is today Israel and Lebanon, that little tiny strip of land there, is because you need that little tiny strip as a place to move trade from Egypt and Africa up into Europe and then into the Mesopotamia, the areas we today think of as Iraq and Iran. There were big trade routes. If you could set up a toll booth, which is effectively what they did, and charge people toll as they moved back and forth, there was big denarius to be made in that. So that's why the Romans wanted to be there. I tell people in Bible study when I show them on the map, essentially it means that, to remember this, the middle, that part, Israel and Lebanon and all that kind of stuff, that's basically the Delaware of the Middle East. You just need that little tiny piece of land that you can set up a toll booth, and everybody goes through Washington, New York, has to cross through there. And the Romans wanted to control the economy, and they did. And this was a sign that they controlled it. Every single time somebody saw the face of the emperor on the coin, they were reminded of all of those things. So, Jesus, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? If he says no, it's not. Every single Herodian in the group is going to instantly tweet out that Jesus is going to be leading an insurrection against Rome. He tells you shouldn't pay your taxes and you should revolt against the emperor. And if he says, yes, it's legal to pay taxes to the emperor, then every Pharisee is going to instantly tweet out to everyone they know that Jesus doesn't care about God and about the law of Moses and about worshiping foreign gods, because Jesus said, oh, it's okay. So then Jesus does something that they totally don't expect. They bring him the coin, and he says, okay, so whose face is that? Whose title? And they say, well, it's the emperor's. And he says, okay, well then give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and give to God the things that are God's. In one sense, it's as though Jesus is saying, if this thing has the face of the emperor, and it belongs to the emperor, then, well, give it back if that's the emperor's. But the bigger question is this. If the thing with the emperor's face is the way I render things back to the emperor, what is the coin that bears the image of God so that I can render that to God? What coin is there that has God's image? Isn't it the person holding the coin? Isn't it you? Isn't it me? Isn't it, in some bizarre, twisted sense, even the emperor whose face appears on the coin? The really remarkable thing that Jesus is saying, the thing that amazes these guys, the Pharisees and the Herodians, and that they leave him, is that Jesus starts talking not about the coin made of silver, but the coin that's us. And he starts to ask people to consider, how is it that you are God's coin? How is it that you are the coin that God is calling to do something in the life of the world? In fact, to do exactly what this coin did, but maybe in a different way. See, every time somebody saw the face of the emperor, somebody saw this coin, they were reminded of the presence of Rome and the presence of the emperor. And it very often is the case that the only way people are going to see God's face, or to be reminded of God's presence in their lives, is when you or I show up in their life. When you or I are willing to be the reminder that God is not out there someplace, but actually is right here with us. It may be as simple as we are the people that brought in diapers and food, and were the answer to prayer of somebody who said, I don't know how I'm going to take care of my child. But we became the reminder of God's presence. It may be as simple as somebody was lonely, feeling down. You were the person who picked up the phone and called. You were the presence, you were the coin in that person's life. Jesus calls us to think of ourselves as not just people who wander around aimlessly, but as people who are created in God's image, with the ability to remind people and to be the presence of God in the lives of others. And because of that, kind of like this coin, we also have the ability to affect how people feel about God in their lives. You know, I know a lot of people who have been able to help folks experience God's love, God's mercy, God's friendship in their lives. It's just the way they show up and the way they care for others, the way they act and behave. As soon as somebody starts to talk about God, they start to get a warm feeling of somebody loves me. I know other people who every time they start to talk about God, it's about how maybe God would love you if you would change a little bit. God wants this from you, and God expects that from you. And it's full of judgment, and it's full of arrogance. And every time then somebody else comes along and says, hey, let me tell you about what I think God's doing, immediately it has the same effect that the coin had when they talked about the emperor. But as God's coins, we got the ability, we are invested with the value of being able to help people feel God's love and God's presence, or the opposite. Jesus is calling us to remember that each time we are the coins who show up in the lives of others. And sometimes, too, the most important way to be God's coin is to remember that how we spend ourselves will make things happen or not make things happen. See, the thing with the coin was, you could say, I'm not going to spend this coin. But there were many times in ancient Israel, during the time of the Roman Empire, where if you didn't spend the coin, nothing could happen because that was the currency. So we're God's currency. We're the people God works through. We're the people God works in to make things happen in the lives of others. And sometimes remembering that and thinking about how we're going to spend ourselves is more important than simply sitting around and going, oh, please God, help this thing to happen. One of my favorite cartoons is a picture that a lot of pastors have put in their office. I couldn't ever find it, but where the one character is sitting there saying to the other character, I tell God all the time, I want God to make world peace and feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And I ask God why He doesn't do something about it. And then God answers me and asks me the same question. Why didn't I do something about it? Because we're the currency. We're the coin that God works through to really do something and to affect change in the lives of others. The bishop who ordained me had a number of sermons that we listened to over and over and over again. Because when you're a pastor, you make sure you listen to the bishop's sermons. But he had a really good line, a really good point that he made several times, where he asked people, he said, you know, what are you going to spend yourself on? What are you going to use yourself up in doing? And he says, and don't tell me you're not going to do it, because every single person has 24 hours in a day. And you get to choose how you're going to spend your time and your money and your energy. How are you going to spend yourself? That really is the question Jesus is asking us. He says, you're the currency. You're the coin. In some respects, rendering to God the things that are God's is the question of how are you going to spend yourself and be God's agent, making things happen. I am the coin. You are the coin. Even in some bizarre, twisted way, the emperor himself was the coin. Because Jesus calls us each and every day to remember that we are people created in God's image, so that we can represent and remind people of God's presence in the life of the world. We are people who God has invested with worth and value, so that we're able to do something meaningful in the life of the world. And we are people who are God's coin, the people whom God works through, so that the lives of others that we encounter can be positively affected by the ways that we choose to spend ourselves.